This video is brought to you by Raycon.
Spring is in the air. The sun is coming out at last. And you know what that means. It means the birds and their darn babies making a bunch of noise! Good thing the latest model of the Raycon Everyday Earbuds features active noise cancellation, which makes the still emptiness of winter erupting suddenly into a euphoric wellspring of new life slightly less annoying. And now that things are starting to warm up, you know I'm gonna be getting outside more. So I sure am glad that my Raycons can get up to 8 hours of battery life on a charge and up to 32 hours using the charging case. Quick charging means that I can get 90 minutes of performance with only 10 minutes of charging, so I'm ready to go at a moment's notice. The latest Raycons sport loads of new and returning features. Multiple sound profiles, multi-point connectivity for pairing to multiple devices at once, the ability to easily take calls, and they still look great, they sound great, and they feel great. They're still the comfiest earbuds I've ever used, and I never have to worry about them falling out. All for about half the price of other brands with similar features. And you can get 20% off your own pair by heading to buyraycon.com/Arlo or by hitting the link in the description. All orders come with a 30-day happiness guarantee, so you can purchase with confidence. Thanks again to Raycon. Now if you'll excuse me, get out of here, you darn birds! You're ruining my life! Down in Fraggle Rock. First things first, many thanks to Capcom for providing me with a review copy of Monster Hunter Wilds. You are always so good to me, Capcom. I thank you. Speaking of Monster Hunter Wilds, though, today we are talking about Monster Hunter Wilds. I am a newer fan of the series, and I have been extremely excited to get my hands on... Excuse me? Can you get out of the shot, please? Thank you. Anyway, Monster Hunter's just great, and you know, as a monster myself, I really appreciate the representation, even if the goal is to slaughter monsters by the hundreds and turn their body parts into pants, but hey, you take what you can get. So without further ado, here is my review of Monster Hunter Wilds. Okay, maybe just one further ado. There, now we can start. Monster Hunter Rise was my first Monster Hunter experience, and I had an absolute blast with it. I finally got what made the series so special. It did, however, take a lot of work to get into the swing of things. Rise was the most streamlined, approachable title to date, yet I still felt like I was drowning in a sea of tutorial text and menus and complicated mechanics. Fortunately, you don't need to understand absolutely everything in order to start enjoying these games, so I managed okay. And even more fortunately, Wilds does a much better job of easing the player into the gameplay loop. Mechanics are introduced very slowly across the entire campaign, which is essentially one long tutorial. You'll roll credits and still be learning stuff from the post-game missions. Admittedly, there are still plenty of systems I just don't bother with, and my previous knowledge probably helped a lot. There are just so many little bits of equipment and services and whatnot to tinker with. It really is a lot, but it feels a lot less overwhelming this time around. That said, though, there is still a lot that Capcom could do to make the experience smoother. After so many titles, it is really hard for me to understand why the menus are this bad. If anything, this right here is going to be the most intimidating thing for new players, trying to decipher these massive walls of stats and options and keywords that are meaningless out of context. What is all this? And even with this mess, pertinent info is somehow still hidden behind submenus and multiple button presses. It's very cumbersome, and it's starting to seem like the devs either genuinely don't know how to better present this stuff, or they feel that this is the best way to do it. I don't know, but it could be so much better. Item management on the field is similarly fiddly. Depending on your strategy, you may be expected to swap between and use many different types of ammo and traps and health and status potions and buffs and food. There are the items in your food pouch, which are separate from your main item box and also separate from the item pouch you access when writing your Seikret. Many thanks to the localization team for ensuring Mr. Roboto is stuck in my head at all times, by the way. There's a fully customizable radial menu, which helps in its own way, but swapping between different radial menus within radial menus, it's a huge pain, and it takes a ton of tweaking. I do like how there are recommended healing item selections built into your main wheel. That was pretty nice when I was trying to figure all this stuff out. But it should not have taken as long as it did to figure out. On top of all that, you've got all these different controls for your hook and your little pod launcher, and there's a whole suite of controls just for when you're on your mount, which is incredibly overwhelming at first, especially when you're in the middle of a story thing, and it's shoot the thing with the thing, and you're I don't know what I'm doing. As streamlined as the series is becoming, the ways that items are managed and pertinent information is conveyed to the player still need so much work. Speaking of streamlining though, it's obvious even to a newer player like me that the entire process of hunting monsters has been pared down to its most important elements. There are still a lot of those between hunt systems to fine-tune, but hunting itself is very basic. You hit up on the D-pad and your trusty Seikret scoops you up and sets you on a beeline to your target. Beyond a couple instances where the story asks you to track down pieces of evidence first, there is essentially no hunting going on here. From what I've heard, preparation and tracking used to be a substantial part of the experience, and I can imagine that this auto-tracking thing is probably where many old players will part ways with the series. Myself, I am torn. And that's because the game itself is torn. It doesn't really know quite what it wants to be. It's definitely not what you would call an open world game, perhaps open zone. Areas are certainly bigger than the ones I traversed in Rise, and you can move between them and base camps seamlessly. This not being a strictly open world experience is by no means a problem. It's just that the game has done a bit of an awkward job integrating the new openness with the more rigid mission structure of previous games, and much of what it tries to accomplish is kind of undermined by the desire to streamline the hunting process. More connected and seamless areas to explore without a time limit is exactly what I wanted when I played Rise. I just love exploring and messing around at my own pace. Wilds is essentially what I was looking for, and yet now that I have it, it's not working for me as I thought it would. There's just not really anything to explore here. The monsters in any given area are still tied directly to missions, which trigger when you engage them. All the same items are spread pretty evenly across every map, and you'll pick up all the ones you need on the way to where you're going. These locales certainly are imaginative and fun to look at sometimes, but they're really just big fish tanks to hold all the stuff you're supposed to farm. I get it, it fits the formula. I just wish there was any incentive to go off the beaten path and see what you find, because this openness is so new to me. I want to know what it can do for me. Plus, Wilds introduces this whole weather system that changes the environment in real time, and it promises all these interesting, dynamic monster interactions. But honestly, I barely ever recognize that the changes are even happening or what they're doing for me. It's mildly interesting, but it doesn't alter the gameplay as much as I expected. It doesn't feel as much like a living, breathing world as I think a lot of the marketing material had me believe. I would say the upside to this open-ish format is that it's perfect for when you just feel like cruising around and hitting stuff. Maybe you're farming for parts, maybe you're practicing with a new weapon, or maybe you and your friends just want to mess around. In these cases, it's nice to have something of a more free-form experience. I haven't gotten to play multiplayer much, but I can see that the multiplayer component is fully fledged with lots of great options for making and joining lobbies and either aiding other hunters or calling for aid yourself. I'd say in the context of hunting with your buddies especially, this new format is a nice option to have. It's smoother, requires fewer menus and less waiting. That is essentially it though. And on the subject of your Seikret, I got a Seikret, automatically taking you everywhere, I will admit, it's pretty nice. I mean, no matter where I am, no matter what I'm doing, that thing will get me where I need to go. It's nice in its own way to just not have to bother. I mean, I'm terrible at navigating in video games. I tend to get all turned around and confused and scared. But on the other hand, now we've got all these open areas that, in theory, I could have a fun time navigating, yet I have no reason to. I can imagine the previous titles. I can imagine the fun of tracking down a monster, feeling like it's a real creature in a real ecosystem. And there's really something to be said for making the player perform certain tasks manually. It adds to the feel of the experience. It helps immerse you in the world. Especially considering how organic the monsters themselves feel, I'll bet real tracking and manual navigation make them feel even more so. But it's a balancing act. Some players will appreciate that kind of gameplay, others will find it tedious or overwhelming. I do enjoy not having to think about much when I'm on the field in a lazy kind of way. I mean, geez, you don't even have to veer off track to collect items. You just grab them with your hook. You don't even have to get out of your seat. And your map displays the location of literally every single monster and item in real time, so you always know where everything is. This sure as heck does streamline things. It gets you to the fights faster, but truth be told, it almost completely disconnects me from the world. I feel very little sense of place, little sense that I'm a person navigating a natural environment. It's all just floating between points of interest on autopilot. It's like a bus route. And that's a bit of a shame. It's hard to blame Capcom for this awkwardness, however. They've got the monumental task of doing everything they possibly can to keep appealing to older players while sanding down the edges that have been keeping new players away. The series started as this very dense, complicated thing, and it's been steadily growing in popularity thanks to becoming less dense and complicated. And in cases like this, where do you draw the line? How do you strike that balance? How do you appease the highest number of players? There is no one correct answer, unfortunately, and I'll bet it's especially difficult to make and implement these decisions over the course of several years of development time. Sometimes you gotta just pick something and see how it turns out. I do think the devs need to spend more time tinkering with the formula and considering what kind of game they want to make. How open do they want it to be, and how do they justify that openness? Are there even more classic ideas, even very good ones, that are worth leaving behind entirely in service of a more approachable experience? I certainly don't have all those answers, and I don't envy the ongoing job they've made for themselves. At the very, very least, though, I think the Seikret is worth examining very closely. It's probably the smallest detail that has the biggest impact on the game. The ability to move automatically is hugely, hugely convenient, but perhaps this is one line that has been streamed a hair too much. If the option is there, people are gonna want to use it, and it could be argued that it simply cuts back on too much of what makes a game fun. Like, I'm imagining a version of the game where autopilot is disabled, and that's literally the only change, and I feel like it would appeal to a lot more old players without losing any of the new ones. The experience is plenty approachable without autopilot, and it very well may lose more folks than it gains. So, I don't know, we'll see if it survives to the next title. Those unfamiliar with Monster Hunter may hear all this and wonder where the actual fun comes in. If things have been so streamlined that you barely even have to play the darn game anymore, what's left? Well, I'll tell ya. Every single thing you do in Monster Hunter is in service of fighting the monsters themselves. And even if much of the game threatens to feel either over or underwhelming, even if there are a number of mechanics that could be done better, it all melts away when you land that first blow and the hunt is truly on. It's hard to grasp how much fun Monster Hunter combat is without trying it out for yourself. You really gotta get your own hands on it. To most, it will feel sluggish and unwieldy at first. But really, it just demands a lot more patience and positioning and careful observation and all that. And when you get it, when it clicks, it feels incredible. One reason is that the monsters are just so amazingly animated. They move so naturally, they react viscerally to your attacks. As you wear down their health, they either grow sluggish or become enraged. Again, it's hard to really explain, it's something you've got to feel. It's like you've never fought a video game boss that felt less like a video game boss and more like a real animal. This makes every encounter feel substantial and satisfying. And the entire gameplay loop consists of hunting monsters to gather materials, using those materials to craft better weapons and armor, using those weapons and armor to hunt stronger monsters, etc., etc. And etc., and etc., and etc. So yes, that means the whole thing is one big grind fest. But if it gets its hooks in you, that means an endless stream of fun. And of course, the encounters become more complex as the difficulty ramps up, so your experience with each individual monster will change as you and your abilities grow in strength. It's a heck of a loop, let me tell you. There's a reason this series just keeps growing and growing and growing the more people get their hands on it. Another big reason the combat feels so good is that right from the start, you've got access to 14 different weapons, each one with a distinct fighting style and moveset. And I'm sure I'm not the first person to ever say this, but it basically feels like you've got 14 games in one here. The weapons really are so incredibly different from one another, changing the way you navigate the battlefield and how you approach any given monster. And there's a weapon for just about everyone. Some are relatively simple, some are highly technical, some are slow and powerful, some offer lots of mobility. There are melee weapons and ranged weapons. For those curious, I am in love with the aerial moves the insect glaive grants me. And when I get tired of fiddling with bug juice, I switch to the agile and simple dual blades. And more recently, I wanted something real simple and reverted back to my first love, the hammer. Those are pretty much my three go-tos. And each one offers such a unique experience that switching never fails to make the game feel fresh and exciting all over again. It's great because you can pick just one favorite and stick with that for the entire experience, or you can cycle between all of them or any number of them, like every weapon is perfectly viable. Monster Hunter combat has been refined and refined over the course of a huge library of games, and Wilds refines it even more so. The biggest change is the new focus mode, where you can hold the left trigger to highlight weak body parts and aim your attacks. Damaging individual monster parts was one of the things that made combat in Rise feel so darn good. And now, being able to aim with precision makes it feel doubly so. Each weapon even has a special attack that triggers when you land a focused blow on a weak point, and chaining these together feels absolutely incredible. It's one of those features that works so well, it becomes difficult to imagine the series without it, and I can only hope it becomes a permanent fixture. It is my impression that Monster Hunter has never exactly been what you would call story-heavy. Rise's plot was quite bare bones, really just there to give you a reason to get out and start hunting and learning the basics. And in a grindy series like this, it made perfect sense. Wilds is no different in that the campaign really does act as one long tutorial, and those who truly immerse themselves in the game will be playing long after the final chapter is closed. However, I was surprised to find that the story itself has been juiced up considerably. There's an honest-to-goodness plot with plenty of characters and cutscenes, and your hunter even speaks this time around. The game utilizes the more seamless environments and frequently has you and your NPC friends venturing off to complete some task or other. You'll look for clues, track down other NPCs, or engage in a good old-fashioned walk and talk. This seems to be a very big change for the series, and I'd say there are upsides and downsides. On the positive side, the characters and plot are decently enjoyable. It's all very over the top, but I'd say most of these folks are likable enough. The story is all about the bizarre ecosystem in this weird, long-lost place, so there's a mystery you get to slowly unravel. I think the writers could do a better job of fleshing out the world if they wanted to. A lot of details are just kind of glossed over in an almost childlike way, but the bits of world building they do give are fun. Clearly a good amount of care has gone into the cultures and styles of this region, which I really appreciate. And hidden among the relatively tropey, simplistic dialogue, they drop a few surprising gems here and there. There's some little character moments that are actually touching. You know, tiny morsels of philosophical ponderings and whatnot here and there that make these characters feel a bit more human, like they're actually living out this story along with you. I also appreciate how the plot moves in a less predictable way. It's still more or less split up into chapters and missions, but you'll frequently find yourself swept up into scripted sequences, high-octane chases, sudden encounters with particularly intimidating baddies. And I found all this genuinely exciting. It's just a lot of fun. And the animators have done such a good job of making every new monster look like the most impossibly huge and vicious beast that has ever lived. Like, these showdowns, they feel like death sentences. My heart drops into my stomach as I'm watching the cutscene. Half the fights genuinely feel like they could be the last boss. But no matter how big and scary the thing is, your hunter just kind of buckles up and the fight starts. The story intimidated me at every turn, and I guess that made me feel all the more amazing when I came out on top. Sure, the monster is never as big as it looks in the cutscene. It's kind of comical, actually, and after getting a read on its attacks, it's often quite easy to dispatch. And for each and every one, you're gonna be coming back later and wiping out tons of these things to farm for their parts. And yet, the magic of that first encounter, I just found it so effective. The support characters really look up to my hunter, and I can see that respect being earned. It's a cool dynamic. I can absolutely see how many players, especially longtime ones, might be pretty annoyed with a lot of this story stuff. Especially the slower, more rote sequences between the major fights. It can feel that things have been, padded to a pretty good degree. But I think overall, I like what it does to the game's feel, the game's pacing. It helps ground me and prevent the plot from feeling like another overly simple series of fights, and that's it. Just a checklist. If the slightly disappointing environments and the Seikret's autopilot cheapen the experience a bit, the plot at least keeps me present and paying attention. Like those more open environments, though, the story is also kind of split between the two experiences the game simultaneously wants to be. There were a couple times when I felt a little tired of being railroaded between plot points. The game wants to tell a story about people making their way through various areas and coming upon obstacles and trouble, but this is also Monster Hunter, where many folks will just want to get out there and hunt freely. It's a little awkward being stuck in one place and taking on missions that let you temporarily warp somewhere else for a hunt and then warp back so you can continue with the story. It's of course nice to have the option without just absolutely being stuck, but it also highlights this tug-of-war match I'm talking about. Wilds does everything it can to have its cake and eat it too, for better or worse. Finally, let's talk presentation. For starters, the music is quite good. Rise's soundtrack didn't quite mesh with me, but here I frequently find myself remarking how good some of these tracks are. In battle especially, the music can do a lot to really ramp up the intensity. It's another thing that can make even a pretty basic monster encounter feel like this big event. As for visuals, stylistically, the game looks quite good. The cartoonish characters with their impossible weapons and impractical armor have really grown on me. The armor in particular is always fun to look at. The artists did a bang-up job adapting all these monsters into equipment wearable by a human. As I mentioned earlier, I love all the various cultures you connect with throughout your journey, all the little details in their clothes and the decorations and the villages and all that. Every area of the game is fantastically designed, very grand and imaginative, but just feasible enough. Later in the game, you get to see a lot of these huge natural formations and human-made structures that can really take your breath away. Which, of course, makes it all the more disappointing that I'm not more encouraged to freely explore and manually navigate, but whatever. There's no denying, though, that on an artistic level, Monster Hunter Wilds delivers. Perhaps World was more on this level, I don't know, but Rise felt pretty small and constrained compared to this. This is quite grand. Unfortunately, though, that's not to say that this game looks good. Because honestly, it doesn't. It does not look good. And that's because Monster Hunter Wilds runs really, really terribly. I hate to say it, I don't want to be all sensationalist, but no, really and truly, it runs really, really badly. It seems to just be terribly optimized. The frame rate isn't the worst, especially when I keep the game set to prioritize frame rate. It's fairly consistent. There are occasional dips in more dramatic battles, especially with lots of weather effects and all that. It's still probably not where it should be. There are some pretty dramatic slowdowns sometimes, but it's passable. It gets the job done. Maybe in a different game, it would not be acceptable, but compared to this next issue, it seems like nothing. The real problem is the visuals. I don't think I have played a AAA game from a big publisher in the last few generations that has struggled to maintain a decent resolution like this one. To call the textures muddy would be an understatement. This isn't just muddy, this is mush, this is a swamp. What textures? I don't see any textures, I just see a mushy, swampy mess. And see, it's not even just the textures though, it's everything. It's how the entire thing is rendered. There's like a low-res haze over everything. It barely matters how the game looks at its core when you're viewing it through this pixelated screen. And it's really unfortunate because the starting area of any game is supposed to show off its overall style. It's supposed to be like a part of the game's identity. And indeed, this first map is in all the marketing material and on the cover and everything. This is where the game is supposed to show off what it's got to new players. This is the first impression. But this place here, it's covered in these weird rocky formations and is most often dry and barren. And after going through the whole rendering process, what shows up on your screen looks positively dreadful. I mean, just dreadful. Crude, single-word descriptors leap readily to the front of one's mind, even in wholesome individuals such as myself. This isn't the best the game's got. This is literally the worst. Like, this is the worst. This is the iconic imagery that is supposed to capture our imaginations in the opening hours. You know those super improbable Switch ports we've gotten over the years? Where they took current gen games and against all odds got them running on that little system? And it worked, they were playable, but boy, the experiences were dramatically compromised. That is kind of what this game looks like. Like it evokes the spirit of those Switch ports. I've heard plenty of people fall back on the usual claims that it looks like a PS3 game or looks like a PS2 game. That's a big one. But I don't think that's true. It's not that the graphics are old-fashioned. It's not that they're behind the times. It's that they feel like they're running on inadequate hardware. If I want to be slightly more generous, it's kind of like I'm playing the Xbox One version of a Series X game, where clearly it was designed for the latter and had to be scaled back to run on the former. And it's not even a cross-gen game. This is a current-gen exclusive, designed for hardware with this level of power. Yet it constantly reminds me of playing The Witcher 3 on my Switch. And I'm playing on console. I don't even know what PC players are going through right now. I can't even imagine. Obviously, this is hugely disappointing. The game is still plenty enjoyable in its current state, but I'm not gonna lie, the performance does have a pretty meaty negative impact. I mean, of course it does. It's doubly hard to lose myself in these environments when they look this bad. It's hard to appreciate these designs when they're lost in this mush pile. And it's all just so confusing. One, the game doesn't look even almost good enough to justify performance this bad. We're used to overly ambitious games that are maybe a little too pretty for their own good. You know, the devs put so much work into packing these games with so many little details and utilizing all the shiniest new techniques that the games have kind of a hard time keeping a steady frame rate or like the highest resolution possible. It's a thing, we're used to it. But nothing about Monster Hunter Wilds, I mean nothing about Monster Hunter Wilds is particularly ambitious. No single element is that impressive. No single element looks that good. The environments are artistically detailed when taken at a glance, but they're not technically impressive by any means. The game is bigger and more open compared to previous games in the series, but this is not even close to a huge living and breathing sandbox world. It just doesn't make sense. But even more confusing This is Capcom we're talking about. If anyone in this industry is known for making gorgeous, impeccably optimized games, it's Capcom. They've worked miracles on even the weakest hardware. Speaking of Switch, Monster Hunter Rise looked impossibly good on that system, and still managed to maintain a steady frame rate. It's genuinely one of the prettiest games on Switch, looking and running better than many of Nintendo's own in-house titles. I just would never in a million years have expected Capcom, of all developers, to make a game that runs worse than basically any other notable AAA game this generation. I could be wrong, but nothing's coming to mind. My only guess is that they just don't have a lot of experience with bigger games. When crafting scenarios with relatively small scopes, they excel, clearly. But perhaps the more open nature of Wilds, as slight of an upgrade as it feels, was a challenge they simply weren't ready for. Maybe even just getting rid of some of those seams and introducing these weather systems and tracking all the monsters on the map in real time, maybe that was enough to put a huge strain on their game engine and they just didn't have the time they needed to properly optimize? That's all I can imagine. Something about this project took them totally off guard and they just couldn't figure out what to do. I really don't know, but whatever the case, it's a real shame. Despite those baffling performance woes, however, and despite some conflicting design choices and the usual mechanical and information overwhelm inherent to the series, Monster Hunter Wilds still manages to offer countless hours of incredible fun. Mileage may vary depending on where you stand on the whole streamlining debate, but that core gameplay loop is as thrillingly addictive as I could ever want. I'll admit, I'm an extremely casual player and still absolutely a Monster Hunter newbie. I'm less and less likely to play these huge numbers go up games with each passing year. So despite how many hours I could potentially get out of this game in another life, I doubt I'll be grinding my way to the upper Hunter rank echelons and mastering every mechanic on offer. And yet, boy, I just keep finding myself booting up this darn game. I tell ya, whenever I get a spare moment and I just want to zone out on a game, the idea of smacking around some big old beastie is far too tempting to deny. I have decided that I am definitively done playing Monster Hunter Wilds, and I have no idea when I will actually stop playing Monster Hunter Wilds. Boy, oh boy, they know how to get you, don't they? Well, those are my thoughts on Monster Hunter Wilds. Are you a bright-eyed newcomer like me? Or perhaps a disenfranchised old-timer? Whatever the case, let me know down in the... Oh, come on, man. You gotta... What was I saying? I don't know, whatever, video over.